So today I want to talk about something that most people are completely missing about this conflict. Everyone is watching the military developments. Everyone is following the sanctions, the summits, and the statements from world leaders explaining why their side is right. Everyone is tracking the day-to-day movements of a war that has already lasted longer than most experts predicted. But almost nobody is asking the question that actually matters most to ordinary people around the world. And that question is this: if this continues, if this conflict does not end soon, if the trajectory holds for another year, another 2 years, another 5, what does the world look like on the other side? Not for the countries fighting, for everyone else. For the family trying to hold on to the life they built, for the retiree wondering whether the savings they accumulated over 40 years will still be worth what they expected, for the young person trying to figure out whether the world they are entering is the one their parents described, because the honest answer, the one almost nobody in the mainstream is saying clearly, is that if this continues, the world of most of us grew up in, the world of cheap energy, open trade, stable alliances, and predictable supply chains, is not going to be there anymore. Not because of one dramatic event, not because of a single turning point, but because conflicts at this scale, sustained over time, do not merely disrupt the existing world order, they replace it. Today, I want to walk you through exactly what that replacement looks like, country by country, system by system, and generation by generation. What changes first, what follows, and what the world that emerges on the other side actually means for ordinary people's jobs, savings, energy costs, food, and futures. So let us begin. The first thing you need to understand, the foundation on which everything else today rests, is this: prolonged conflicts do not merely disrupt the existing world order while everyone waits for them to finish. They reshape it permanently. The world that exists when a long conflict ends is never the world that existed when it began. History is unambiguous on this point. The First World War did not simply pause European civilization for 4 years and then return it to where it had been in 1914. It ended 4 empires, redrew the map of an entire continent, created the conditions for a Second World War, and established a new global order that lasted until the 1990s. The Cold War did not freeze the world in place for 45 years. It reshaped every economy, every alliance, every technology race, and every political system on Earth, including the ones furthest from its epicenter. And when it ended, the world that emerged was not a return to 1945, it was something entirely new. The mechanism is always the same. When a major conflict sustains itself over years, 3 things happen simultaneously. Governments make decisions under pressure that they would never make in peacetime. Decisions about debt, about alliances, about industrial policy, about social contracts, and those decisions outlast the conflict by decades. Supply chains and trade relationships that were disrupted do not simply reconnect when the shooting stops. They are replaced by new ones, built around the new geopolitical reality, and those new connections become permanent. And the generation that grows up during the conflict emerges with a fundamentally different understanding of what the world is, what is safe, and what can be relied upon. And they carry that understanding into every decision they make for the rest of their lives. The answer to that question depends entirely on one thing: how long this continues. The longer it runs, the deeper the reshaping goes, and the less of the familiar world survives intact on the other side. Let me show you exactly what that means actor by actor and system by system. On the surface, global trade looks like a background feature of modern life. Something that happens invisibly, reliably, and at scale, ensuring that the products people buy are available, affordable, and continuously improving. Most people interact with global trade every single day without thinking about it. The smartphone in your pocket was assembled from components manufactured in 43 different countries. The food in your kitchen crossed multiple international borders before it reached the shelf. The clothes you are wearing were likely produced on the other side of the world. But underneath that surface, the global trade order that made all this possible was never a natural condition. It was a political construction built deliberately after 1945 on a specific set of rules, institutions, and military guarantees. The United States Navy patrolled the sea lanes, the World Trade Organization enforced the rules, the US dollar provided the common medium of exchange, and the underlying understanding that all nations, regardless of political differences, would benefit from open markets and would therefore have an incentive to keep the system functioning, held the whole architecture together. If this conflict continues for another 2 to 3 years, that architecture is not going to survive intact. The fragmentation has already begun. Since 2018, the share of global trade conducted between geopolitical allies has been rising, while trade between adversarial blocs has been falling, a process economists call friendshoring. The conflict has accelerated this trend sharply. Nations are no longer asking only which supplier is cheapest. They are asking which supplier is geopolitically safe, and those two questions have very different answers. The consequence for ordinary families is specific and sustained. When global trade fragments into competing blocs, the efficiency gains that made goods cheap disappear. A world in which every nation buys its semiconductors from a politically aligned supplier, its energy from a geopolitically trusted source, and its food from a regionally secure producer is a world in which all of those things cost more permanently. The 40-year era of falling consumer goods prices, which quietly raised living standards for hundreds of millions of families, comes to an end. Not suddenly, not in a single shock, but steadily, year after year. As the trade architecture that made cheap goods possible is replaced by something more fragmented, more politicized, and more expensive for ordinary families in every country that benefited from the era of globalization. The continuation of this conflict means living in a world where the cost of ordinary life is structurally higher and where no single decision made by any individual can reverse that structural shift. Now let us look at the alliance system that has kept the world's major powers from fighting each other directly for 80 years, and what its erosion means for everyone. On the surface, the Western alliance system, NATO, the network of bilateral security agreements between the United States and its partners in Europe and Asia, the shared intelligence frameworks, the coordinated sanctions regimes, looks like a permanent feature of the geopolitical landscape. It has existed in one form or another for 80 years. Most people alive today have never known a world without it. But underneath that surface, the Western alliance system is under more structural strain than at any point since its creation in the late 1940s. And the strain is not coming primarily from external adversaries. It is coming from within. The United States is spending approximately 3.5% of its GDP on defense, a figure that has been politically contested for years, and that is increasingly competing with domestic spending priorities in a country that is simultaneously managing $34 trillion in national debt. European NATO members collectively spend less on defense than the alliance's own. Stated targets require, and the domestic political coalitions that once made sustained defense spending uncontroversial are fracturing in country after country. In the United States, the political consensus that built and maintained the alliance, the bipartisan agreement that American global engagement serves American interests, is being challenged more seriously today than at any time since the 1930s. If this conflict continues for another 3 to 5 years, the alliance will face a test of political will that its architects never had to manage. Sustaining military and financial support for a prolonged conflict in the face of domestic inflation, rising debt, and an electorate that is increasingly asking why their country is paying for someone else's security is a political challenge of a different order from the challenges the alliance has previously navigated. The consequence for ordinary people, if the alliance phrased significantly, is not abstract. The 80-year period of no direct military conflict between major powers, The longest such period in recorded European history was not an accident. It was a product of a deterrence architecture that made the cost of major war too high for any rational actor to accept. If that architecture weakens significantly, the probability of miscalculation, escalation, and conflict between major powers rises, not to certainty, but from near zero to something meaningfully higher. And for every family in every country covered by that architecture, that probability shift is the most consequential. Long-term change this conflict could produce for ordinary families who have lived their entire lives in the security provided by that 80-year peace, the erosion of its foundations is the most important story of this conflict that is receiving the least serious public attention. Now let us look at the energy system, the infrastructure that powers everything else, and what its permanent restructuring means for how people live. On the surface, the global energy system appears to be in the middle of a managed transition from fossil fuels toward renewables, proceeding at a pace that is debated but broadly understood. Governments have targets. Companies have investment plans. The technology is improving. Most people following the energy story believe that the transition is happening, even if arguments persist about how fast. But underneath that surface, this conflict is not merely disrupting the existing energy system, it is forcing a permanent restructuring of it at a pace and in directions that no energy transition plan anticipated. And the restructuring has two simultaneous and contradictory pressures that make it uniquely difficult to manage. The first pressure is the immediate crisis pressure. When energy supply is disrupted by conflict, the immediate political imperative is to secure supply by any available means, which means extending the life of existing fossil fuel infrastructure, signing new long-term agreements with alternative suppliers, and building the import terminals and pipelines that lock in fossil fuel dependency for 20 to 30 years. Europe did exactly this. After 2022, it built new LNG terminals that are now committed to 20-year supply agreements. Those agreements were rational responses to an immediate crisis, but they are also structural constraints on the energy transition that will outlast the crisis that created them by decades. The second pressure is the long-term strategic pressure. Every major economy has now concluded from direct and painful experience that energy independence is a national security imperative, not just an environmental or economic preference. That conclusion is driving an acceleration of domestic renewable energy investment that is genuinely historic. The International Energy Agency reported in 2023 that global clean energy investment had for the first time exceeded global fossil fuel investment. That crossing point was the most important energy statistic of the decade. But the transition it represents will take 15 to 20 years to fully materialize in the energy mix that ordinary families actually use. If this conflict continues, the energy world on the other side will be structurally different from both the world of 2019 and the world that energy transition plans envisaged. It will be a world of regional energy blocks, each optimizing for security over efficiency, each paying a premium for that security, and each investing in a combination of renewables and fossil fuel backup that is more expensive than either alone would be. For ordinary families, that means higher energy costs as a permanent structural feature of daily life, not a temporary disruption, but a new baseline. For ordinary families in every energy importing nation, the world on the other side of this conflict will require a fundamentally different relationship with energy. One where it is no longer cheap, no longer invisible, and no longer someone else's problem to manage. Now let us look at the financial system, the mechanism that funds governments, businesses, and household lives, and what a prolonged conflict does to it. On the surface, the global financial system has demonstrated remarkable resilience throughout recent years of compounding stress. Banks have remained solvent, currencies have remained functional, governments have continued to borrow and spend. The system that almost collapsed in 2008 appears to have been strengthened and stabilized. From the outside, The financial system looks like it can absorb whatever is thrown at it. But underneath that surface, the global financial system is carrying a debt load that makes its apparent stability deeply contingent on conditions that this conflict is actively undermining. The combined government debt of the G7 nations, the United States, the United Kingdom, Germany, France, Italy, Japan, and Canada, stands at approximately $65 trillion. That is not a number that can be held in mind meaningfully. So let me make it concrete. The interest payments alone on that debt at current interest rates consume a larger share of government revenue in most G7 countries than at any point since the Second World War. Not the debt itself, just the interest. Prolonged conflict makes this problem structurally worse in three simultaneous ways. Defense spending rises, adding to the debt. Inflation, driven by energy and supply chain disruption, forces central banks to keep interest rates higher than they would otherwise be, increasing the cost of servicing the existing debt. And the economic slowdown that prolonged uncertainty produces reduces the tax revenues that governments depend on to manage both their spending and their debt obligations. All three forces move in the same direction at the same time. The consequence for ordinary families is not a financial collapse. That is not what this analysis suggests. It is a slow, sustained fiscal squeeze in which governments have less money to spend on the services and transfers that families depend on precisely when the cost of living is making those services and transfers more important. The healthcare system becomes more stretched. The pension system becomes less generous. The public infrastructure that supports daily life, roads, schools, hospitals, receives less investment, not because of any single dramatic decision, but because the mathematics of debt servicing, defense spending, and reduced growth simply leave less room for everything else. For ordinary families, the financial world on the other side of a prolonged conflict will be one in which government support is less reliable, private financial planning is more important, and the margin for error in household finances is smaller. Then, the generation now in retirement was accustomed to expecting. Let us now look at the demographic and social consequences, the changes to how people live together that will outlast any financial or geopolitical adjustment. On the surface, the demographic and social consequences of this conflict look like a humanitarian story. Refugee flows, displacement statistics, population movements. These are real and serious, and they receive significant coverage. But the deeper demographic and social consequence of a prolonged conflict is something that is almost never discussed in mainstream geopolitical analysis, despite being perhaps the most consequential long-term effect of all. When a major conflict sustains itself for years, it forms a generation. Not merely in the countries where the fighting occurs, but across every society that lives through the period of sustained uncertainty, economic stress, and institutional strain that a prolonged conflict produces. And the generation it forms carries the marks of that formation for the rest of its life. We have historical evidence for what this looks like. The generation that came of age during the Great Depression of the 1930s was permanently shaped by the experience of economic insecurity. Decades later, long after the economic conditions had normalized, that generation saved at rates that puzzled economists, avoided debt with a discipline that seemed irrational in a period of stability, and maintained a distrust of financial institutions that persisted until their deaths. The experience of scarcity and uncertainty in formative years created behavioral patterns that no amount of subsequent prosperity could fully override. The generation coming of age now, growing up through pandemic disruption, then energy crisis, then sustained geopolitical conflict, is forming its understanding of what the world is and how it works in a context of compounding instability, the economic optimism, the institutional trust, and the willingness to take the kind of long-term risks that a growing economy requires, starting businesses, taking on mortgages, investing in education and skills, are all behaviors that form in conditions of stability and erode in conditions of prolonged uncertainty. If this conflict continues for another 3 to 5 years, the social and demographic world on the other side will include a large cohort of young people whose foundational economic experiences have been almost entirely negative. And the consequences of that formation for entrepreneurship, for family formation rates, for political participation, and for the social trust that makes complex modern societies function will play out over decades, long after geopolitical situation that produced them has been resolved. For ordinary families with children and grandchildren, the question of what world this conflict is forming to the next generation is the most personal and the most lasting consequence of all. And now let us come to the actor that holds the most capacity to determine whether the world that emerges is one that ordinary people can still recognize as their own. On the surface, the geopolitical world is currently defined by this conflict: the alliances, the sanctions, the military developments, and the diplomatic maneuvering that dominate the coverage. The war is the story, everything else seems secondary. But underneath that surface, a fundamental restructuring of the global order is being constructed, quietly, deliberately, and with a speed that the Western world has not fully registered, by the nations that are not primarily defined by this conflict. China, India, Brazil, the Gulf states, much of Africa and Southeast Asia. Together, these nations represent more than half of the world's population and a rapidly growing share of its economic output. And they are not watching this conflict as passive observers. They are using it as an accelerant for the transition in the global order that was already underway. The specific architecture being built is a multipolar world, a world in which there's no single dominant power setting the rules, enforcing the norms, and guaranteeing the security of the global trading and financial system. Instead, there are multiple centers of power, each with its own rules, its own currency arrangements, its own security frameworks, and its own definition of what constitutes legitimate international behavior. The BRICS expansion of 2023, which added Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Iran, Egypt, Ethiopia, and Argentina to an organization that already included China, Russia, India, Brazil, and South Africa, was not merely a diplomatic development. It was a structural signal that a significant portion of the world is actively building institutions that do not depend on Western-led frameworks. If this conflict continues for another 3 to 5 years, that alternative architecture will have had time to solidify, trade relationships will have shifted, financial infrastructure, payment systems, reserve currencies, credit arrangements will have been partially diversified away from dollar dominance. The institutions and frameworks that the post-1945 world order was built on will still exist, but their authority will have been diluted in ways that cannot easily be reversed. For ordinary families in every country, the emergence of a genuine multipolar world means living in a more unpredictable environment, one where the rules of international commerce, travel, and finance are less consistent, less enforceable, and less reliable than they were in the era of American-led order. It means higher costs, greater uncertainty, and a requirement for a different kind of adaptability than the generation now in late life was ever asked to develop. So now let us zoom out and look at the biggest picture of all. Because what we have just walked through, the global trade order, the Western alliance system, the energy system, the financial system, the demographic and social consequences, and the emerging multipolar order, is not 6 separate stories. It is one story about one thing, the end of a particular kind of world and the beginning of a different one. The world that most people in wealthy and middle-income countries grew up in. The world of falling consumer prices, open borders for goods and capital, reliable energy at low cost, governments with the fiscal room to maintain generous public services, stable alliances that kept major power conflict at bay, and institutions that could be trusted to function predictably. That world was not an accident. It was the product of a specific set of conditions that came together after 1945 and held together for approximately 70 years. Those conditions are now under more stress from more directions simultaneously than at any point since they were established. And the critical point the one that the day-to-day coverage of any specific conflict consistently misses, is that conditions of this kind do not merely bend under prolonged pressure, they break. And when they break, what replaces them is not a return to the previous equilibrium. It is something new, built around the new reality, shaped by the decisions made under crisis, and carrying the marks of the conflict that produced it for a generation or more. This is not a counsel of pessimism. Every major transition in world history has produced genuine hardship for the generation living through it, and genuine opportunity for the generation that understood what was changing and positioned itself accordingly. The families and individuals who come through major transitions with their security and dignity intact are almost always the ones who looked clearly at what was changing, not the ones who assumed it would all revert to normal, and not the ones who panicked. They are the ones who saw clearly, planned accordingly, and retained the adaptability to adjust as the new reality became clearer. And that is what this analysis is for. Not fear, not fatalism, to clear sight. I want to end with the most surprising conclusion that comes out of this entire analysis. The finding that when I followed the evidence carefully, genuinely changed how I think about what is happening. You might expect me to say that the nations best positioned to survive the transition to a new world order are the most powerful ones. America, with its military and economic dominance. China, with its manufacturing scale and strategic patience. The Gulf states, with their energy wealth. The countries with the largest armies, the most advanced technology, and the deepest financial reserves. That conclusion seems obvious. Power protects, but actually, no. When you study which nations and which communities have historically navigated major world order transitions with the least disruption to ordinary people's lives, the factor that matters most is not power. It is institutional trust. The degree to which ordinary people believe that the institutions managing the transition are honest, competent, and working in the public interest. Consider what happened during the two most significant world order transitions of the 20th century. The end of the British imperial order after the First World War, and the end of the Cold War after 1989. In both cases, the nations that managed the transition best for their ordinary citizens were not the most powerful. They were the nations with the highest levels of institutional trust, where governments maintained credibility with their populations, where courts remained independent, where information was reasonably reliable, and where citizens felt that the institutions managing the crisis were genuinely accountable to them. The Nordic countries in the 1920s and 1930s, the smaller Central European democracies in the 1990s, nations that were not global powers, but that maintained the institutional integrity that allowed them to make difficult collective decisions and implement them effectively. The nations most at risk in a prolonged world order transition are not the smallest or the poorest. They are the ones where institutional trust has been most severely eroded, where populations no longer believe that their governments are telling them the truth, where courts are no longer seen as independent, and where the social contract between citizens and the state has frayed beyond the point at which collective action becomes possible. In a world that is genuinely changing, the most valuable thing a society can maintain is not military power or financial reserves, as important as those are. It is the capacity to make honest, collective decisions together. That is not weakness. That is the deepest form of strength a society can possess. And it is the one that this conflict is testing most severely in the nations that once took it most for granted,